Hello, and welcome to World Literature 1, uh, Antiquity to 1650. And uh, hopefully by now you're settled and got the book and everything. Took it a little slow at the beginning. Gave you a couple days for that first assignment, and we'll probably pick up the pace a little bit now. And we're going to start. I'm going to do first of a few uh, video lectures. And, they're not my favorite format. Obviously, I'd rather be talking to you in the flesh so that you could talk back to me. But nevertheless, it's what we've got available to us in an online asynchronous class. And, you know, I love teaching this class because it gives us an opportunity to not just think about literature the way we usually do as, an object of analysis. Certainly it's going to be that, but also to really think about the human story itself, going all the way back to the origins of what we might call culture, or sort of more problematically civilization itself. And the interesting thing about a work like Epic of Gilgamesh is that it in some ways somehow feels really familiar at the same time that it feels really ancient and distant. Um, you kind of have both those experiences as you're reading this text. And, the whole idea of a hero going on a quest and fighting monsters and looking for secret wisdom is not that far removed from the kinds of, quest narratives we still read and enjoy today. Anything from like a Star Wars movie to a video game, right? Where those themes are still very much kind of a sort of expected cliche, right? Um, it's also a story about friendship in a way that, I wouldn't say it feels modern, but certainly familiar, right? The idea of two like enemies fighting each other and then sort of coming together out of mutual respect and forming this powerful bond of brotherhood. That also is something that you come across a lot in movies and stuff today still, right? The idea of the sort of kind of bro partnership between two guys who start out as enemies. I wouldn't say enemies, but they start out fighting and then they end up friends, right? Gilgamesh and Enkidu, which is one of the things I asked you to reflect upon for that first forum. What I really want to talk about today in particular, though, are some of the sort of historical and anthropological uh, resonances of this text, which I really find fascinating, and which I think, are a good starting point for the class. We're going to be reading a lot of. They always say when you make these video lectures, don't be too specific about the class itself because you'll want to reuse them for other classes. But if my future self could indulge me for a second, in this class, we're going to be reading a lot of these so-called epics, right? These adventure stories with heroes and monsters and action and fighting and some kind of goal to be achieved, whether it's Gilgamesh or the Aeneid or Beowulf or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, or even Paradise Lost, which you could think of as a kind of epic in a different way. Dante's Inferno, right? A lot of stories like this, and so it's a good starting point for the class in that sense, in terms of genre as well. All right, so if you let me sort of get this slideshow going here. The slideshow might help keep me from uh, going on for too long. But yeah, so this is not just a work of literature, Gilgamesh, right? It's a historical document of the most significant kind, right? And it's hard to say it's really hard to say when this work was written, because it exists in many different forms, right? And whatever forms we have it in are hardly the original form, right? Oh gosh, hang on. Got the spinning wheel of death over here. Just no. I just love working from home. It's great. My dogs are barking now. Probably somebody walking in front of the house. Okay, here we go. Back up. So we talked if you read the introduction, like I said, to and if you watch the video on foundational text, you know a little bit about Mesopotamia. It's this very important region in the history of human civilization itself. And I have this little map. Maybe I could go to the map for a second. Great. Where's my map? Here you go, Dan. Where are? Sorry, the thing I'm supposed to be up here is not up here. Where are you? Just a little map. Okay. We sometimes refer to it more broadly as the ancient Near East, or the ancient Middle East, whatever. I don't really like calling it the ancient Middle East because that gives the wrong idea. Middle East is a very modern geopolitical term, and when we're talking about the history of the region, ancient Near East is more in common use. Come on. All right, here we go. All right, so you got our little map here. When we're talking about Mesopotamia, here it is right here. Mesopotamia means land between the rivers, and we've got the Tigris River and the Euphrates River, right? And in the middle is Mesopotamia. That is hardly, the extent of ancient Near Eastern civilization, but that's kind of where it gets started. And when we say civilization, it's fraught with all kinds of biases about what civilized means or what civilization means. But generally, what we mean when we talk about beginning of human civilization is something like, the definition would include density of permanent residence, or in other words, cities, right? Some kind of urban center with monumental architecture like temples, right? City walls. Obviously, an agrarian society that depends on agriculture, right? In the hinterlands, right? And some kind of state apparatus, a king, bureaucrats, officials, taxation really is probably the main thing, right? That kind of human human cooperation, right, is what we're talking about when we talk about the origins of a sort of urban civilization. And the oldest ones are in the almost oldest, what we might call cities, are in Mesopotamia, and Uruk obviously is the city that's at the center of this text. Uruk may be the oldest true city in the history of human civilization, although these things are never certain. And there are obviously very old cities in Egypt and in China, right? But probably Uruk, right, is our well, for our purposes, let's say it's the oldest. Okay. And the thing about Mesopotamia, of course, is that you might have learned this in high school at some point, right? These rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, they flood in this sort of regular and predictable way, and the flooding enriches the soil, which makes agriculture, fixed field agriculture, very successful, and made it possible to have enough agricultural production to support a more urban kind of civilization. We don't need to get too into the historical stuff. It isn't a history class after all, and I could talk about it forever because I love talking about it, right? But geography has a lot to do with why the ancient Near East is such a central part of what we would call Bronze Age civilization. Bronze Age being like, basically around 3000 BC to, let's say, 1200 around BC. The Bronze Age collapse happens roughly 1200 BC. You don't really need to worry too much about dates and stuff like that. It's enough to know we're talking about a long time ago, like 3,000 years ago when we're talking about the Bronze Age. Gilgamesh as a text probably first appears around maybe 1300 BC, something like that. Although it's really hard to say. Anyway, so like the ancient Near East is full of very successful quote unquote civilizations, right? With urban architecture, and we've got, the true Mesopotamian cultures, like in the Mesopotamian region, like Babylon, right? Like Assyria, Akkad, and then you've got Egypt, of course, right? Which is what we always think of when we think of ancient Bronze Age civilizations. We think of Egypt. You've got Cyprus, the Cypriot culture. You got the Minoan culture in Crete. You've got the Hittites up here in Asia Minor. And you really had this early sort of international human trans civilizational culture, right? They weren't just their little enclaves, right? They had trade, they had foreign relations, they obviously had war. We know there was a lot of war in ancient times, right? You also have the Mycenaeans out here in Greece, who will become really important to us in about a week when we get to the Iliad. Gilgamesh, though, as a text, is a text that really is, in many ways, about the whole idea of civilization itself. And I don't know how much that was apparent to you as you were reading, but there is a real underlying thematic through line of the contrast between quote unquote civilization and the wilderness, or what is untamed, or quote unquote uncivilized. And I need to stress that I use civilized in quotes. When I'm speaking, I say things like quote unquote civilized, because civilization is in itself a kind of value judgment, and it's a value judgment that is subjective, right? Why were the ancient Egyptians a civilization, but like the hunter gatherers of the steppe, right, or the steppes in Asia Minor were not a civilization? Whatever, I mean, I'm not here to make that kind of value judgment, but I'm saying from the perspective of the text, right, it's very much about civilization versus wilderness. For example, there's Uruk here, right, which is a city that goes back all the way back to the ancient Sumerians, right, founded by the ancient Sumerians. Gilgamesh as a text, the version we have is probably a product of the Akkadian culture, right? But the myths and legends that came out of old Sumer sort of spread around and took root. And it's very complicated in terms of the linguistic transmission and everything. And, the Sumerians spoke a completely unrelated language from the Akkadians. And there are some loan words and things like that, but the languages themselves are very different. But here's Uruk. For instance, Gilgamesh travels from Uruk when he fights Humbaba, goes out into Lebanon in the Rift Valley, right? Which is somewhere around here, right? In other words, you're going sort of from civilization out into the wilderness, out into the forest of cedars, and it's this dangerous and scary place. And in many ways, the battle between Gilgamesh and Humbaba sort of represents this battle, this clash between civilization and its hinterlands or its outskirts. And the relationship at the center of the story itself, of course, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, very similarly represents that same dichotomy. Now, okay, I'm doing what I always do, which is instead of sticking to my PowerPoint, I'm having a one-sided conversation that I find interesting. I don't know how many other people do. Let's get back to the PowerPoint, though, because I can sort of try to keep things a little bit on task here. All right, so it's loading. Okay. So, okay. Yeah, 1900 BCE, that's a long time ago, of course, right? We don't, when I say we don't know exactly when Gilgamesh was written or composed, that's because there's no doubt that the versions of Gilgamesh that we have that come from stone tablets or clay tablets like this with cuneiform text do not represent Gilgamesh as it was originally composed, right, or written. The story itself, the pieces of the story, right, predate writing, right? They existed and came down and were transmitted in a purely oral form long before they were ever written down. So you really can't talk about the year Gilgamesh was written or anything like that. All you can say is the version that we have. Can we say anything about when it comes from? Probably around 1200 BC. Gilgamesh was probably a real person in some sense. Obviously, he wasn't the mythic figure of the stories, right? But he was this, likely a priest king of the city state of Uruk, right, which is in modern Iraq. And he is reputed to be the builder of Uruk's walls, right? The thing that kind of makes it a proper city. And let's turn to the text for a second. There's no online version of the Norton Anthology of World Literature. So for the translation that we're using, you should follow along these lectures with your book. All right. I'm on page 22 right now, 23. And let me just read a little bit. I'll just start from the beginning. Let's read the opening of the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? He who saw the wellspring, the foundations of the land. Now, of course, this is a translation in English from an Akkadian text. So always remember that there's a lot of subjectivity in a translation, especially a translation of a 3,000-year-old text. He who saw the wellspring, the foundations of the land, who knew the ways, was wise in all things. Gilgamesh, who saw the wellspring, the foundations of the land, he knew the ways, was wise in all things. Let me stop right there. A couple things to say. First, you see right from the outset this focus on repetition. Right? You've got two lines, and then the two lines repeat. He who saw the wellspring, the foundations of the land. Gilgamesh, who saw the wellspring, the foundation of the land, right? Who knew the ways, was wise in all things. Who knew the ways, was wise in all things. There's a lot of repetition in the text. Now, that's what the first thing to realize is that's a stylistic affect. Of course, it seemed proper when you're writing poetry and ancient Akkadian to have that kind of repetition, right? But it almost certainly evolved as a kind of mimetic device. And by that, I mean something that grew out of the poem's oral tradition, right? Its oral provenance. Before writing, right? When these stories circulated orally, and maybe you had sort of specialized bards or storytellers or priests or whoever it was that were the repositories of these legends and myths. Yet it's hard for us to grasp this notion, but it's simply true that you couldn't write things down because writing didn't exist. And repetition in a story or a myth or a legend, repetition in a poem or a song, right? What does it do? That's right. It helps us remember, right? It's an oral. It's what we call oral formulaic writing, right? It's part of the style of something that was composed orally. It's an artifact of its provenance as something that was transmitted without writing, right? So you have a lot of repetition. You have a lot of what we call epithets, where phrases are repeated a lot in formulaic ways, so that the storyteller or the priest or whoever or the bard could remember it. And this works, obviously, because think about your favorite songs. Or actually, don't think about your favorite songs. Think about a song you kind of know, right? What part of the song do you remember? The hook, right? Why? Because you hear the hook 3 or 4 times in the song, whereas the verse you only hear once, right? Repetition is mimetic. It helps us. Sorry, not mimetic. It's mnemonic. It is mimetic, right? It repeats, and therefore it sticks in your head, right? It's mnemonic repetition. It helps something stick in your mind. It helps you remember it. Okay. The other thing about this opening is that you see right away this idea of Gilgamesh as a founder, a builder, a civilizer, right? He's not just a monster killer. He's also somebody who literally like built Uruk the way it is, right? So he saw the foundations of the land. He was the wellspring. The wellspring is the thing for that it all flows out of, right? Gilgamesh himself is a kind of origin point. And then most importantly, let's just go to the top of page 23. Full understanding of it all he gained. He saw what was secret and revealed what was hidden. He brought back tidings from before the flood. We're going to get to that, right? In the second half of the reading, which I'm posting. From a distant journey came home, weary at peace, engraved all his hardships on a monument of stone. That line 10 there, very important, because what that is talking about, engraved all his hardships on a monument of stone, it's talking about the act of putting deeds into writing, which is, of course, the only way we know about most of this stuff, right? Somebody thought to write it down. Archaeologists will tell you they can learn a lot just by looking at the physical remains. I think sometimes archaeologists make up half the stuff they say they know. You can see here from these scorch marks that this city was clearly pillaged in the year 1245 by the sea peoples. But when you have something written down, it can preserve a kind of detail that you wouldn't have just from archaeological remains. So Gilgamesh engraved his hardships on a monument of stone. In other words, he wrote down his deeds, right? And then he built the walls of ramparted Uruk. 12. He built the walls of ramparted Uruk. We're going to come back to this idea, right? But note, you're going to hear this again and again and again. Ramparted Uruk. That means Uruk with defensive walls that Gilgamesh built. What do those walls do? What do city walls do? They create a barrier, a border between civilization and wilderness, between the cultured peoples and all the dangerous stuff that's outside, right? Why did you need city walls? Well, in a text like Gilgamesh, or even like, something like Beowulf or whatever, right? The wilderness is a place of monsters, right? Of scary creatures and beasts and things like that. But, in real life, you weren't worried about monsters. You were worried about other people who would want to take what you have. So those walls represent enclosure. They represent defense. They represent separation between the civilized, right? The city, the urban center, and those people who sort of exist beyond it, or the stuff that exists beyond it that is a threat to it, right? All right. So let's see. Anything else to say about this slide before I move on? Okay, yeah. So about cuneiform, right? You've probably heard this term before. And let's move ahead here. Cuneiform, here's the picture of the cuneiform, of the tablet with the cuneiform writing. Cuneiform means wedge-shaped, and you can see the symbols are made out of these little wedge shapes that were made with the back of a reed of cedar. Okay, extension blocked. Okay, thank you. Let's move on here. Here's an aerial shot of Ur, which is another city-state in Mesopotamia. Just give you an idea of like the kind of archaeological evidence we're working with. It doesn't look like much here. I almost prefer sometimes looking at artists' renderings so you can see what they really look like, but that's an archaeological. Okay, back to cuneiform. Originates around 2100 BCE. Now, it's really difficult to overstate just how important this is. So in the third millennium BC, basically, right? You begin to see the emergence of cuneiform writing, right? This wedge-shaped script. We're talking about Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is what matters to us most. The first parts of the Gilgamesh cycle were probably set down around 2100 BCE. That's not the same version that we have. I mean, just to be clear, right? There are many different versions of Gilgamesh, right? Cuneiform is a writing system that was very adaptable. It was used by many different for many different languages. Originally, it was for Sumerian, right? Ancient Sumerian. It also was used by Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and it actually became a kind of sort of lingua franca for different cultures and civilizations to communicate with each other. You could write in Akkadian in cuneiform script, and it could be read by scribes in Egypt and in Crete. And the Hittites, they used it for international relations as well because it was so well known. But it begins as this script developed by the Sumerians to write in the Sumerian language, which is a really weird, strange language. It's not related to any language that currently exists. And if that were the only version of Gilgamesh we had, it would be very challenging for us. Luckily, it was adapted into this Akkadian language that was used by the Babylonians. And it's again, I don't want to get too into the weeds. There's so many cultures and stuff in ancient Mesopotamia. But Akkadian, the cool thing about Akkadian is that it belongs to the same linguistic family as some languages that still exist today, the Semitic languages, that is Hebrew and Arabic, right? Which, of course, as we know, are also languages spoken in the Near East, in the Levant, etc. So it's much easier for us to read Akkadian than it is for us to read Sumerian. I don't know how. It blows my mind that they can read any of it, frankly, but we can. Somehow people have figured it out. But I guess one thing I want to say before we move on, because we are on this sort of on this theme of civilization, right, and what that means exactly. We understand how important writing is to civilization. I don't know that we often think about why it's so important to civilization. Without writing, hang on, I gotta pause this for a second. My wife is calling me. Okay, all right, sorry. Kind of moving on here. We were talking about cuneiform. I got this double monitor set up here, so I've got like notes on one side, and it's not the most elegant setup here. That's why I keep kind of looking back and forth. So we were talking about the development of cuneiform. Remember, a writing system is not a language, right? So the ancient Sumerians invented cuneiform, but it was used by lots of different people speaking lots of different languages in the ancient Near East. Cuneiform was first. Very soon after that, you had Egyptians developing, hieroglyphics, which we all know about. Why is it so important? Why is writing so important? It's not just about writing literature, and that's hardly the most important thing. Writing was an administrative tool, first and foremost. And writing is what allows you to have larger and larger groups of people living together as a cohesive whole. Writing allows record keeping, right? Writing allows communication over longer distances, right? Accurate communication over longer distances. Basically, what writing is the system of encoding data, right? If you think about what allows quote unquote civilization to exist, right? What you need for it, you need a state, which means you need a ruler, you need laws, you need administrators, you need taxes, right? For all that stuff, you need record keeping. And that was the need really that drove the development of writing. It wasn't about telling stories about guys fighting monsters, although it's nice that we have a record of that as well, because as scholars of literature, it was one of the things that you can have civilization without writing. You can. And, or at least, I don't know, like I'm not a historian, so I'm not really sure like about technical definitions of these things sometimes, but for instance, the ancient Incas were a great civilization, as I think of it, had no writing. They had those quepu knots or whatever, the kepu knots or the beads or whatever it was that they used. Didn't keep them from being a great civilization. But it does limit you in some ways in terms of the size and scope and what you can achieve sort of administratively. But it was one more way in which sort of civilization was made distinct from non-civilization, at least in the minds of those in Uruk or in places like that. It allowed control. Okay, you with me so far? Okay. We've got city walls. We've got writing, right? These are things that demarcate civilization from non-civilization or the barbarian hinterlands or whatever you want to call it. Again, those are value judgments that are not mine. Those are value judgments that would have belonged to the people of a place like Uruk itself, right? Or at least the elite. Writing was not something that everybody did. Reading and writing were not generally possessed skills, right? If you were a fisherman, out, on the Mediterranean coast somewhere, or if you were a farmer in the fertile banks of the Tigris, you did not read and write. It was reading and writing was strictly for a sort of an elite or a professional, specialized class of scribes whose job it was to record great deeds, to keep track of tax records and inventories and all kinds of boring. Most of the stuff that you see, most of the cuneiform tablets that archaeologists have discovered are really boring. They're about and then we traded 20 jars of oil for 16 bushels of wheat or whatever. It's very, very administrative, most of the cuneiform tablets. The other things they did was they recorded the deeds of kings and the names of kings, right? And the record of kingly deeds. If you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, you can see a lot of this stuff. I love it. I'm fascinated by it. But, most of the stuff that exists in cuneiform is not like real exciting adventure stories like Gilgamesh. It's like telling, King so-and-so did such and such in such and such year at such and such time, et cetera, right? Which, again, very valuable to historians. Some of it you got to take with a grain of salt because people aren't in the habit of telling the truth always about their kings. But yeah, cuneiform is the writing system that basically made Mesopotamian civilization possible. One of the things, anyway. We'll get to the last one in a minute. All right, let's go on here with our slideshow. Okay, so Gilgamesh, we call it the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it does roughly belong to a genre that we call epic, right? What are the characteristics of epic, right? They're stories of significant length. The subject matter is usually a blending of the historical and the mythic, and we'll see this again and again and again with Gilgamesh, with the Aeneid, with Beowulf, with I don't remember, is the Iliad on the syllabus? I think it is, yeah. Check my own syllabus here. We'll see this again and again, this blending of the historical and the mythic, right? The Trojan War. Did it happen? Yeah, probably it happened. Did it happen the way it happens in the story with gods and, fighting alongside humans and it's, and no, of course not, right? So you get this blending of the historic and the mythic. Same thing with Gilgamesh. Did he exist? Of course. Yeah. Well, I don't say of course. Sure. He seems to have existed based on the evidence that we have. Was he fighting monsters in the Forest of Cedars and slaying the Bull of Heaven? Probably not. Just using our common sense, those things probably didn't happen. So you get this blending of the historic and the mythic is a very important aspect of epic writing traditionally. Divine intervention, obviously a big one. By motifs there, it just means that there are these themes that seem to sort of repeat and be reinforced throughout a work. I already mentioned civilization and wilderness is one of them, obviously. Life and death is another one in Gilgamesh, right? The idea of friendship. But, to me, Gilgamesh is really about civilization and it's about mortality. Those are the two big motifs of the story. Divine intervention, important, right? Humans and gods interacting with each other. I wouldn't say coexisting so much as sort of existing on these separate planes that sometimes come together and clash. That's how Enkidu comes to be part of the story in the first place, right? Because Gilgamesh is not being very friendly to his people. The gods send him something to keep him busy. And of course, when Ishtar gets very angry at Gilgamesh for rejecting her advances, and Enkidu is slain as a consequence. The idea of heroic flaws, right? Generally, the heroes in epic are not, perfect. Gilgamesh certainly fits the bill there. And I already mentioned about orality, the blending of oral elements with written, oral origins becoming a written text. Epics also generally have a kind of elevated language, right? They're not written the way people spoke, right? Hang on. It's hard for us to really evaluate Gilgamesh in that way. We don't speak Akkadian, but the translator has tried to make it clear, right, that there's a formal nature to a lot of the language, right? It's elevated language. It's not the language of everyday speech. It's poetry, right? It's poetry at the end of the day. It's an important part of what makes epic epic. It might not be poetry the way we understand it, the way we think of it. When we get to the Iliad, right, we'll be able to talk about the idea of poetry in a way that's much more familiar and understandable, right? But certainly it's elevated language. It's interesting language, not just everyday language, right? So those are some of the elements of epic language, and Gilgamesh, more or less fits the bill, and people can quibble about whether it's really an epic, but at the end of the day, these categories are pretty subjective. We call it the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's very much like other ancient epics. To me, it's an epic. So is Beowulf, for that matter, which is another one that people might quibble with. Yeah, and then here's some of those, like, those themes, those binary oppositions that you see in the story. Nature and civilization is a big one to me, right? The one I'm really focusing on today, but certainly these other themes exist as well. The first half, right, very much focuses on the aspect of civilization, right? In the second half of the story, once Enkidu is killed, it becomes very much a musing on the nature of mortality itself. Of course, the idea of going out of one's home and then coming back to it, a big part of these sort of mythic quests, right? Love and sexuality. There's no love interest for Gilgamesh. He obviously had wives and children, right? It's not really an important part of the story. The main way in which sexuality enters into the story is through the character of Shamhat, which I want to talk about in a second, right? Physical and intellectual journeys, right? So there's the physical journey of Gilgamesh fighting the monsters, right? But then there's the intellectual journey of him seeking out this secret wisdom of immortality from Utanapishtim, and obviously doesn't work out the way he would have hoped. All right. When are you just gonna? Where's our thing about? Oh, wait. Let's talk about dichotomies for a second. This is a quote from Tablet 11, page 145. Go up, Urshanabi, pace out the walls of Uruk, study the foundation terrace, and examine the brickwork. Is not its masonry kiln-fired brick, and did not 7 masters lay its foundations? The story ultimately comes back to this, again, this idea of that humans are mortal, humans die, but our works can outlast us, right? Things like the walls of Uruk. So the dynamic between civilization and wilderness also interacts with the dynamic between life and mortality. Let's go back for a second. All right, yeah. I want to talk a little bit about the friendship of Enkidu and Gilgamesh. This is all right. So obviously the initial. This is what I asked you to write about for your response paper. Gilgamesh is not the best king. The text keeps asserting that he's this great king, but also it is very clear that he is mistreating his people in some important ways, right? So if you have the book open, and you should, turn to page 24. Now, let's see. We hear all about how great Gilgamesh is, but then all of a sudden at line 55, we get a sense that he's perhaps not the most conscientious ruler, right? In the enclosure of Uruk, this is line 55 on page 24. In the enclosure of Uruk, he strode back and forth, lording it like a wild bull, his head thrust high. The onslaught of his weapons had no equal. His teammates stood forth by his game stick. I always laugh at that. It makes me think, like, when they would play whatever sport they were playing, it's like he never passed. He was a ball hog. I don't know exactly what that means. His teammates stood forth by his game stick. I'm not an Assyriologist or an ancient Near Eastern scholar, right? My PhD is in 16th century AD, not BC. But he was a bully, basically, right? He was harrying the young men of Uruk beyond reason. Gilgamesh would leave no son to his father. He was a bully. He would beat people up. He would kill people. He would always constantly sort of asserting himself with violence. Day and night, he would rampage fiercely. This was the shepherd of ramparted Uruk. This was the people's shepherd. Bold, superb, accomplished, and mature, Gilgamesh would leave no girl to her mother. The warrior's daughter, the young man's spouse, goddesses kept hearing their plaints. The gods of heaven, the lords who command. It's all right. So what are we learning here about Gilgamesh? He's a sort of uncontrollable force, and he's violent to the man, and the implication seems to be that he rapes women. They wouldn't really call it that. I mean, he was sort of asserting his his privilege to take whatever woman he wanted, young girl, the daughters of his soldiers, the wives of other men didn't matter. So although he's this great, powerful, wise, and mighty king, right, in that is always sort of interwoven with everything, it's clear that he is also terrorizing his own people to an extent, right? And let me just sort of momentarily just divert into the anthropological again for a second. We tend to think of civilization as a good thing, right? As an advance over whatever human beings were before, hunter-gatherers, nomads. But the truth is probably that in ancient times, especially in the Bronze Age, that being part of a civilization, being the subject of a state, even a primitive state, was probably not always all that great. You were expected to do as you were told. You had to provide. You had to farm to provide to not just for subsistence, but to provide taxes to the state, right? You couldn't just sort of go off and do what you wanted, right? You were subject to the authority of this apparatus, right? That had control over a lot of your life. If you lived in a small band of nomadic hunter-gatherers, I'm sure life was challenging in its way, but you also probably had more freedom than the average citizen of Uruk did under the control of a primitive state apparatus that was based on agricultural taxation and warfare, basically. So you got this king, Gilgamesh, and he's your protector, and he's your founder, and he builds walls, and he does all these great things, but he also is kind of a jerk, and you can't really do anything about it because he's the king. Now, in the story, he's not just the king, he's also the strongest, sort of most powerful, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the gods come up with this idea to create a kind of foil for him, right? There they are. So here we've got Gilgamesh and Enkidu fighting together, and this is, guess who that is? Humbaba. It's not how I picture Humbaba, but they're the experts, right? And there's a lot to say about Gilgamesh and Enkidu, but I think the thing to say at the outset, right, is that the contrast between Enkidu and Gilgamesh establishes the dichotomy between human civilization and the wilderness that is this constant theme throughout the work. Gilgamesh is first introduced to us as the builder of Uruk and its walls, and he sort of represents civilization, whereas Enkidu is this being of the wilds. So let's just sort of read a little bit about Enkidu in the beginning here. First of all, we got the creation of Enkidu. This is page 25. When I say foil, I mean something that two things that set off each other, right? Gilgamesh and Enkidu are kind of opposites that somehow together create this cohesive whole. So Aruru, the birth goddess, here's the other gods say we got to do something about Gilgamesh. So Aruru, who was the goddess who originally sort of birthed the first human beings, creates Enkidu. This is line 91 on page 25. When Aruru heard this, she conceived within her what Anu commanded, Anu, the lord of the gods. Aruru wet her hands. She pinched off clay. She tossed it upon the steppe. She created valiant Enkidu in the steppe, offspring of potter's clay, with the force of the hero Ninurta. Shaggy with hair was his whole body. He was made lush with head hair like a woman. The locks of his hair grew thick as a grain field. He knew neither people nor inhabited land. He dressed as animals do. He fed on grass with gazelles. With beasts he jostled at the water hole. With wildlife he drank his fill of water. I love this passage because it's this really cool image um, of a goddess like just sort of taking this handful of clay and sculpting it into a human being. And of course, very, very evocative and very reminiscent too of a scene that you're probably all familiar with from Genesis. If you remember, we're going to get to Genesis next, right? But when Yahweh creates Adam out of dirt, right, and breathes life into it, Ruach, the breath of life. We'll have more to say about the connections between the Hebrew Bible and Gilgamesh shortly, but just something to think about. And so the person that is created is this wild man of the steppe. Right, the steppe is like the open plain, the wilderness. So Enkidu is out there frolicking with the animals, and I always found that interesting because there were people that were wild in the sense from the perspective of the people of Uruk, at least, right? There were people who, quote unquote, barbarians, right? Who weren't agriculturalists, right? Who were hunter-gatherers still or nomads, and who were dangerous, right? That's why you needed the city walls, right? Because they would steal your stuff. And why not? Why work for it? Why break your back farming if you can just let somebody else farm and then take it? There were people out there in the wilderness, right? Enkidu doesn't belong to some tribe of barbarians, though. He literally is like a man beast, like an animal man. He lives with animals in the steppe. So really emphasizing the fact that he is a product of the wilderness, that he is this untamed, uncivilized thing, right? As a contrast, as a foil to Gilgamesh. And he's out there, he's destroying the traps. He's messing up the hunters' livelihoods. So they complain. And then there's this really fascinating, I want to talk a little bit about the civilizing process here. And maybe this is what we'll wrap up with for today, because I don't want this to go on too long. People can only watch a video lecture for so long. It's not like, it's not something that, you can do for 2 hours, right? And there's a limit to how long people can watch a video lecture for. The way they decide to deal with the wild man Enkidu is to civilize him. How do they civilize him? Well, first and foremost, they civilize him with sex. They bring in this Shamhat, the prostitute, but prostitute in a particular sense, right? She's not like, I don't know, right? We think of prostitute, we think of like something a little seedier, right? Like a streetwalker or something, or I don't know. She's a temple prostitute, right? She has this sort of ritualistic function. Don't ask me to explain it in exactly, right? But she's almost like a kind of priestess, right? So Shamhat is brought to Enkidu, right? And he's obviously enamored with her, and they make love for 6 days, 7 nights, right? And it's the language is very it's pretty erotic, right? This is page 27, line 180. Shamhat loosened her garments. She exposed her loins. He took her charms. She was not bashful. She took his vitality. She tossed aside her clothing, and he lay upon her. She treated him a human to woman's work. So he's a human now by virtue of the act of participating in sex with a human woman. As in his ardor he caressed her. 6 days, 7 nights was Enkidu aroused, flowing into Shamhat. After he had his fill of her delights, he set off towards his beasts. So he after he sleeps with Shamhat, he goes out back into the steppe, and all the animals run away from him. Like, they can see that he's no longer one of them somehow. When they saw him, Enkidu, the gazelles shied off. The wild beasts of the steppe shunned his person. Enkidu had spent himself. His body was limp. His knees stood still while his beasts went away. Enkidu was too slow. He could not run as before, but he had gained reason and expanded his understanding. There's a trade-off, in other words. He becomes more human, but in doing so, he loses a little bit of his animalistic vitality. But there are, there are always trade-offs in the civilizing process, right? And I already mentioned a little bit, right? Like being part of a civilization does, in some ways, limit one's freedom, especially if we're talking about in the Bronze Age, right? So Enkidu is not one of them anymore somehow, right? They can tell he's more human now, so they run away from him. And then to complete the civilizing process, where is one second, sorry. So the final step of civilizing Enkidu involves clothing, and it involves food and drink. Now, this is important. And again, I'm going to make an anthropological point here as well as a literary one. All right. So this is on page 30. All right. We're in tablet 2 still. And Shamhat wants to bring Enkidu to Uruk to meet Gilgamesh so they can sort of, become friends or whatever. He can calm him down in some way. So let's see. This is line around 17 after the white space on page 30. He heard what she said, accepted her words. He was yearning for one to know his heart, a friend. The counsel of Shamhat touched his heart. She took off her clothing. With one piece, she dressed him. The second she herself put on. So she puts him in human clothing, right? Clasping his hand like a guardian deity, she led him to the shepherd's hut where a sheepfold was. The shepherds crowded around him. They murmured their opinions among themselves. So she takes him to the shepherds, the agriculturalists, the animal husbanders, right, who represent human beings and they're domesticated animals, right, as opposed to wild animals. Domesticated animals that have become part of the human domus and have serve our needs in some way. They're no longer wild, right? Important contrast, right, between the sheep and the gazelle. The sheep is part of the human cultural apparatus. The gazelle is wild and separate from it. All the shepherds see him, they're like, wow, look at this guy. They murmur their opinions among themselves. This fellow, how like Gilgamesh in stature tall, proud as a battlement. No doubt he was born in the steppe, like the force of heaven. Mighty is his strength. And then so these agriculturalists, right, these shepherds, feed him. They set bread before him. They set beer before him. He looked uncertainly, then stared. Enkidu did not know how to eat bread. Never had he learned to drink beer. The harlot made ready to speak, saying to Enkidu, eat the bread, Enkidu, the staff of life. Drink the beer. Beer, staff of life. The custom of the land. Enkidu ate the bread until he was sated. He drank 7 juglets of the beer. His mood became relaxed. He was singing joyously. He felt lighthearted. He's getting drunk, and his features glowed. And that's sort of then more lovemaking with Shamhat follows. But bread and beer. Why bread and beer? I bet you know. Where do bread and beer come from? Right. I assume you're right anyway. I have no idea if anybody's answering the question. Bread and beer come from grain. Whether it's barley or wheat or millet or sorghum or whatever, right? Bread and beer come from cereal grains. Where do cereal grains come from? Well, you can forage them, right? And that's how the first bread, whatever, the first grains that were eaten were doubtless foraged in the wild. But this bread and this beer came from farming, agriculture, domestication of crops, which is the fundamental basis for all urban civilized cultures of the Bronze Age, right? The thing that sets apart the nomadic hunter-gatherer from the quote-unquote civilized person is agriculture, and specifically the domestication of cereal grains. It's not just about the food either, right? These crops, this wheat and barley and things like that, these cereal crops were the basis of the economies of these early Bronze Age civilizations. It was a kind of currency. It's how you traded. It's how you taxed. It's how you did international relations with other civilizations, right? They represented not just staple foodstuffs, right? But also the very basis on which the state apparatus functioned. And so what civilizes Enkidu? It's the woman, right? But perhaps the final step here is the products of agricultural labor, beer and bread, and the shepherds, right? So, right, this is not just a cool story about fighting monsters, right? It's also very much a kind of propaganda piece about the importance of civilization itself. You got to remember, in the early Bronze Age, civilization was not a fait accompli, right? There were other ways to live, the hunter-gatherer life, right, or the semi-nomadic life, or the sort of sedentism, which was not quite permanent, right? Human settlements, but something more sort of in between nomadic and urban, right? There were other ways to live outside the state apparatus, right? Anyway, city walls, writing, agriculture, right? Urban architecture, writing, agriculture, the markers of civilization, the things that demarcate one kind of human life, right? The new thing, the way forward, right? The great, the thing that we think of as essential to human progress, right? Civilization itself, from the wilderness. And that binary runs through this entire text. So Gilgamesh and Enkidu meet, they fight, they have this huge wrestling match, and eventually they become friends. And we know the great deeds that they accomplished together as friends. But I really wanted to focus on this thematic aspect here in this little video lecture. I'll have more to say. There are more video lectures to come. I'm going to wrap it up now. I think we've gone on long enough. But there are more readings to be posted to the Moodle page, and then we'll just sort of keep on going. All right. Thank you very much. And talk to you again soon.